Hello, I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. My guest has had a lifelong passion for Africa and its people, a passion that began with his first visit nearly 50 years ago. He is both an adventurer and an activist, and he's written many articles about the people and the economy. His personal experiences were the inspiration for his fiction, a trilogy titled The Dark Continent Chronicles. And it is my pleasure to welcome James Gardner.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you.
I am so thrilled to have you here, and I wonder if we can go back nearly 50 years ago and give me your first impressions of Africa.
1968, it was a colonial powers had charge. They'd made themselves the caretakers of Africa and our ancestors, European ancestors. And it's been interesting to watch how this thing has progressed over 50 years. They haven't done well. Africa has, I would say, it's suffered. The standard of living of the average African now is about where it was in 1962. They live on about $1 a day. And it's a conglomeration of kleptomaniacs, really, kleptocracies, that the governments really take most of what's left, or most of the aid that comes into Africa, and the people really are left with nothing. So my interest has been, it started off with a wildlife, a transition to the people and the socioeconomic conditions in Africa, and it's been extremely interesting. I mean, my first trip to what's then Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. And so I've watched that country transition.
When you first got off the plane, that very first time, what were your expectations, and were they met?
They were met. Africa is a land of extremes, extreme weather, extreme human behavior. I've been shown unbelievable kindness, but I've seen also unbelievable cruelty, and it's a land of extremes. The country they've had a problem with that's not well known, of overpopulation. The continent really is becoming overpopulated. You say, well, it's impossible. Look at the size of it. It has 1.2 billion people. If you take the north, the Sahara Desert is about the same size as the United States. And you have two other deserts in the south. You've got the Kalahari and the Namib. So overpopulation has been a problem. But I think, the wildlife it was really the first thing that really I was interested in. And when I went to Africa 50 years ago, there was 500,000 lions in Africa. Now there's 25,000. There was 500,000 rhinos, and they're killing a rhino now every 10 hours. One dies to poachers, so it's a tremendous problem. I've given money to the cause, but it's really a war to try to save this wildlife. It's their heritage. It's really their tourism. Nobody says, "Did you go to Africa? What did you see? Did you see an elephant? Did you see a lion?" So lions really it's a part of the whole African experience, and anybody who's slept in a tent and heard a lion roar, it's something they never forget.
You find yourself in a country full of conflict on many levels, and it changes every time.
It does change. This whole continent was carved up by Europeans, and they really didn't take into account these vast cultural differences. Take, for instance, in the Congo, there's 65 different languages spoken in the Congo.
That's amazing.
There's like 2,000 different dialects, spoken dialects in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see that it's very tough to get these people together. They have a lot of long bad blood in Zimbabwe. In the case of Zimbabwe, there's two primary tribes, the Shona and the Matabele. The Shona make up about 70% of the population. Robert Mugabe is a Shona. And so they have a lot of bad blood that goes back hundreds of years, and it's hard to get these people together. People say, well, "Oh my God, they're savage." Well, they're savage. I mean, India and Pakistan, Ireland, Northern Ireland. You could go through the countries that have been. I think there's something like 47 countries in Africa, and I think in the future there's going to be maybe 65, 70, or 80 countries as they start to split up these people based on their cultural backgrounds and not some geographical border that somebody sets for them.
You know, I don't think we can do justice to your stories without a little background, historical and geographical. Now, when we talk about the geography, and you were starting this, the continent is a lot of desert. So you're not going to grow food on much of this land.
You're not going to grow food on a very large percentage of it. And if you take the Congo, it's so wet you can't grow anything. So the people teeter. They're constantly just between a famine and having food, and they have a very high birth rate. You take the poorest countries in the world. If you take that, it's called a Human Development Index, which takes into account the person's the per capita income of the person, the gross domestic product, their education, and their life expectancy. And you look at the countries the last 50 countries, there are 47 countries. They're all in Africa. The per capita, the gross domestic product per person in Niger is $200. It's $52,000 in this country. And so you can see, and they have a 5% birth growth. So they're overpopulated. When I first went to Uganda in 1972, it was kind of a scary trip. I mean, Idi Amin was just to put out a decree that Indians had to be out of the country in 48 hours, and we landed, and people climbed up on the plane. It was like chaotic. The country had 9 million people. Now it's got almost 40 million people. So you can see that it's growing so fast. And you know, I have hopes that when this world economic juggernaut is moving around the world looking for cheap labor, that eventually it'll make its way to Africa. But I think that's probably in sometime, maybe in 100 or maybe 50 or 100 years, we'll find that.
Perhaps not our lifetime.
Maybe not. Not in my lifetime, I can tell you that.
From what I gather in your books, your heart is in Zimbabwe.
Because I've been there since it was Rhodesia, and it was a beautiful, clean, prosperous country. But really, I mean, you had 300,000, we'll call them Europeans, white Africans running the country with 12 million black, and it just couldn't last. I mean, it was inequitable. It couldn't last. And so now the white population is down to around 30,000. They've left the country, as a lot of people have that have found that this is, you know, I think this is the African view, this is kind of payback time for mistreatment of 300 years, in the case of some parts of Africa for 1,000 years.
I think many of us have forgotten that Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, was the breadbasket.
It was the breadbasket, major exporter of food, corn, maize, tobacco, and now it's a basket case. Mugabe says the unemployment rate is 5%. The World Bank says it's 85%. Having been there a lot of times, maybe 20, I can tell you it's a lot closer to 85 than it is to 5.
You know, if I'm remembering correctly, their literacy rate was one of the highest in the world back, I think, in the early 60s.
96%.
And their dollar was on par with ours. And here we have, what is this, $100
trillion.
$100 trillion.
That's inflation.
What would this buy me?
Nothing. You keep it because it's like a souvenir. But people come out of stores and they get a handful of change, and they just take the change and throw it. You walk on a sea of change when you walk out of these stores because it's not worth anything. And so I had a friend that was a game warden in one of the major Wangi National Park, which has been in the news recently.
Absolutely.
And his pension it was 10 cents a month. So a lot of us got together and kind of supported him and helped him.
You've gone back so many times. Is it the people that you're drawn to?
I think it's the people. I mean, somebody wrote, I wish I had written this line, that Africa marks the heart marks the soul with an unmarked graffiti. I think once it gets in your blood, you're always looking over the next horizon to see something else. I mean, it began to see the mountain gorillas and the coast, the skeleton coast. There's just so many ecosystems, so much to see, and it's just to me, it's just fascinating.
I'm going to guess that some of the characters in here, especially the nice ones, have come from friendships that you have made throughout the years. The first book introduces us to the main character, Rigby Croxford, who is without a doubt multidimensional. He is a farmer, he's a warrior, he's a man struggling with immense changes going on in his country.
he was a Selous scout, which is like a Green Beret in the Rhodesian Bush War, and he has his farm confiscated. He loses the war, loses the country, has his farm confiscated. He marries a Peace Corps volunteer who's an American doctor, who's a liberal, a very big liberal, and of course he's just the exact opposite because
They're good together. I like that.
They have a great marriage, but there's a lot of friction, a lot of constant fighting back and forth. She's very strong. I like strong women characters because I find that most books are read by women. Like 65% of all books are read by women. Men watch TV, women read books.
You don't consider these men's books?
I think that this one, the Zambezi Vendetta, was written more. I think it has very strong women in it, a couple of very strong women in it. And this is, the first one is a man's book, and the last one is a combination of both. But I think that most women, when I get emails, people seem to this Zambezi Vendetta, most women really like that book.
I liked all of them. Is Rigby strictly from your imagination?
No, he's based on a character that I met I met him in a bar in like 1980 during the Dissonant Wars in Zimbabwe, and I was going to take a car and drive, and he listens to me. He says, "You're going to rent a car and you're going to drive this." And I said, "Well, you better put that Rolex up on the bar here because you're not going to make it. This country's going through Dissonant Wars, and you'll get killed before you get there." And so I said, "Well, I guess you better cancel that trip." And then I ended up taking like 17 different safaris with him. And last year I went to Indonesia. I wanted to see the Komodo dragons and the orangutans. So we took a Chinese junk up through the jungles of Borneo to see these things. So I mean, he's been here to this. He's traveled to the Bahamas with me, and he's a very interesting, very educated. He's a journalist, and he's an interesting character. And so I've kind of based my books basically around his life in Africa, modern Africa.
Are you, bottom line, an adventure junkie?
I'm getting pretty old now. My adventure. Most of my safaris have been walking safaris. I assume a lot of you have been to Africa, and it's going in a van is great, but I like to walk, and the walking is at my age getting a little less and less. But you really get out and you really see it. You see the small things, the insects and the plants and my daughter's been, my wife's been on 3 or 4 safaris, and like I say, when you sleep in a tent and you hear a lion roar and the whole tent vibrates, let me tell you something. That's something. I think it goes back to our primordial past that our ancestors were probably preyed on by lions or saber-toothed tigers, but it really makes your hair stand up.
Is being in that close proximity to a lion the most terrifying thing that you have been through?
A couple of times. One time was my wife was already ran into some poachers, and that was because I was with them. I was worried about them. That was kind of But I've been chased by elephants and had a couple of really good charges from lions. About 90% of the time, these are mock charges. These animals really don't want you in their territory, and so I would say that I don't want to scare people. It's really, if you know who you're going with, and the safari operator, it's extremely safe.
Did you write this book to draw attention to all the changes that are happening in Africa? Why did you write this as fiction?
I wanted to bring attention to the problems that Africans face today. But I needed to do it with something that was interesting to read. So I thought a thriller would get people into it. If you read some technical book, and I've read dozens and dozens of books that really, they get into the problems of Africa, but it's so boring that I'd rather do it through fiction, because I think if I point out the serious problems facing Africans, I think you get a good feel for it.
And that was a great way to do it.
No, it's like slavery. You can't talk about Africa unless you have a legitimate discussion about slavery. And today, slavery still exists in Africa. It's a kind of a hidden secret. It's dirty, but it's true. It's about 10% of the population in some of these countries are still caught up in slavery. So it needs to be, and with also the big thing of these kleptocracies, these leaders like Mugabe that are fabulously wealthy, that have taken the money from these people, and the people really like I say, they live on $1 a day. It's sad, and you hope to bring put some attention and keep these politicians. Nelson Mandela was I don't know where he came from. He was absolutely one of a kind. He was very, very smart, a brilliant, just a great leader. Unfortunately, he's just like, there's just not any more Nelson Mandelas out there, and I hope that changes. You know, it's been my 50 years is less than a nanosecond in African history. I mean, we all come from Africa. The first humans stood up in Southern Africa. Science, whatever you believe in, it happened. And so we're related to Bushmen, and you know, I'd like to see them do better. They have a lot of problems, but like I say, eventually, 100 years from now, things may improve. I hope they do.
I hope they do too. You mentioned Mugabe. He continues to be reelected. The country is so much worse with him. Why does he continue to be reelected?
The primary reason that he gets, well, for one thing, in some districts, he'll actually get more votes than they have people. So the elections are a little bit fast.
Okay.
But nevertheless, you talk about these countries, you have to talk about the tribes, the clans, the tribes. He's a Shona. He is their George Washington. He's the one that gets the credit for throwing off the yoke of colonialism, to getting rid of Ian Smith. So he's still probably 90 years old. His wife is supposedly going to take over after he finally croaks, if he ever does. And she's gone back to school now. In 6 weeks, she got a PhD. So she's very, very well. They call her Gucci Grace because she wears a lot of very fancy clothes. And I mean, look, let's just take a look at the Congo. The Congo has $30 trillion in natural resources. The people are the second poorest people on earth. There's a disconnect there, and the president that finally that got assassinated, Mobutu, he put an airstrip in that was 10,000 feet long, so he could land the Concorde, charter the Concorde for his wife to go shopping in Paris. The people have nothing. I mean,
it's hard for us to really
you said,
get
well,
that.
Should we send money? No, you can't send money. If you send money, these people, the leaders will end up with it. So what do? I think the answer is that it seems to me, now I can't positively say this is my opinion, but when I meet Africans, and it seems the more education they have, the less wives they get and the less children they have. And I don't know if that's true, but I think that it is true. And we've had a very, I mean, look, the president, this Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa, he's got 6 wives, 19 children. He's just built a house down there, $20 million house. I mean, it's very sad for the people. I hope that, you know, China has a gigantic presence in Africa right now, and I think if you think of China and Africa, to me, you think the host and the parasite. The host is Africa, the parasite is China, and when they strip that continent clean, they'll leave, and they won't leave much for the people, I can tell you that.
Brings me to ask you this, because the first 2 books take place, obviously, in Africa. In the first book, there's a tourist who has disappeared. In the second book, there are tourists who are in the middle of this bloody coup. The third book, which is certainly a thriller and certainly is scary, takes place in the scary country of the United States.
But the character in the book, my protagonist, is the African that comes to the United States.
But it gets very scary here.
I know.
That was a nice twist. I enjoyed that. You have terrorism in that third book, and I wrote down one of the quotes because there is a very serious financial scare that is taking place in that book, and the quote is, "A rumor can travel through the financial world like a forest fire." We've seen that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that was really my background. My background was in finance. I think that's why I'm interested in African finance, because I've spent my business career in that business.
So it proves you do not have to be in the depths of the African jungle to confront fear.
No, I agree.
It happens right here. The final book, the third book, because I understand there will probably be a fourth book.
I'm about halfway through. It's called The Last Rhino. I'm almost through it now.
The third one is The Honey Guide, and you give a description of this ordinary-looking bird that is anything but ordinary. And I knew when I read that first page that this was going to be a good story. And if you would indulge me, could you just read that first? Just this page, because that's fascinating.
The African black-throated honeyguide is an ordinary-looking bird, but it's far more cunning than most living things. Honeyguides lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species. After hatchlings kill their nestmates, they consume the food foraged by their new adopted parents. When food is scarce, the ravenous chicks sometimes eat the parents. A symbiotic relationship exists between honeyguides and the tribes of southern Africa. The birds lead honey gatherers to wild beehives. As payment, pieces of the hive are left for the birds to eat. Bushmen believe that if no payment is left, the honey guide will take revenge by leading the honey collectors into the path of a hungry lion. I've had these birds buzz around my head. You know, they try to get your attention, and because they want to lead you to a hive. And they also do it, of course, with honey badgers, the animal. So I think it's a fascinating bird.
That was a fascinating piece of writing, too. So
thank
you very much for that. You know, we hear, and you have mentioned it, the genocide, the political repercussions, the conditions that are intolerable in that part of the world that we would never stand for. Do you feel, because you have been back and forth so many times, that Americans are ambivalent?
I don't think they're ambivalent. I think that Africa will become very important going forward. We use up our natural resources at a very, very increased rate, and Africa has it all. They have gold and diamonds and oil, of course, and they have these rare earth minerals that you use in cell phones and MRI machines. So I think it'll become more important as time goes forward, as people begin to use up their natural resources. They'll look to Africa. China, you know, China's been there for a long time. China's been in Africa longer than I have. They knew a long time ago that this was the key to their success. They have to have natural resources. They don't have it at home, and they're going to strip Africa clean. They put in highways. Once in a while they'll build an occasional hospital or a school, and they'll say they're doing something, but they're really doing just about as little as they can possibly do. And I mean, they've got troops. For the first time, they have troops in Africa. They've got 4,000 troops in the Sudan, protecting their oil line that's extracting oil out of Africa. So they're very involved, and they're going to be able to buy these natural resources or get them at a reduced rate, and we're direct competitors with China, and it's not going to be in our best interest to let them have their way.
We could spend hours talking about conservation and wildlife, but I think bottom line, Americans would like to know, is there something that we can do?
I think that some of the World Wildlife Federation is a good one. You know, the wildlife is disappearing at as I said before, one rhino dies every 10 hours to poachers, and there are not many of them left. Last year they killed 1,215 rhinos in southern Africa. 40% of all the rhinos in the world are in the Kruger National Park in that area. And a friend of mine is really they're at war. I mean, since the last 5 years, they've killed 500 poachers there. It's not well known, but I'm telling you that it's a war trying to protect these animals. A rhino horn now is worth $30,000 a pound. It's worth more than gold. And it's mostly in the Orient, Vietnam, China. They believe it cures hangovers and cancer and all kinds of nonsense. It's just keratin. It's just your fingernails. It's all nonsense, but they believe it. And so they're killing these things. The Africans don't get much out of it. And you take an African that makes $1 a day, and you say, well, you can make X number of dollars by poaching elephants or rhino. And it's hard. I think what they need to do, they need to put pressure on their congressman to put pressure on the end user, not try to stop it in Africa. Try to stop the people who are buying it. If you said we're going to embargo some of your goods that you try to ship out, to stop China and Vietnam and these places from importing this product, I think it makes a lot more sense than trying to stop it in Africa. That border with Mozambique and the Kruger National Park is 220 miles long. They've got 65 people. Think of it, 65 people, and you're trying to protect the border from here to Tampa. It just doesn't work.
Well, you make your points through fiction, which we applaud you for. They're wonderful books to read. Your books have gotten the attention of some very well-known, influential people. Nelson DeMille, for one, calls your writing powerful and illuminating. That has to make you feel good.
That did make me feel good. I like that.
And you said you're halfway through book 4?
Book 4, yes.
What's the process? Is it is it tough? Is it fun? Is it?
I really enjoy
I know it's
it.
lonely.
I mean, no, I think it's just absolutely a lot of fun for me. I mean, you know, you go through days where you don't feel like doing it, and then all of a sudden you wake up in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and at my age I have to write notes down because the next day I can't quite remember what I was dreaming about. But I go and I like to re-edit and write and try to make it better, and I really do. And of course, you do a lot of research. You're reading all the time. You're trying to put together facts that really I think could really help some of the problems, from the problems I have in Africa. So I mean, I enjoy the process.
So we know at least one more book, one more trip to Africa too?
We're going next year.
All right. Terrific. It has, and thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for my $100
I wouldn't quit your day job. I wouldn't quit your day job with it.
The books we've been talking about are a trilogy so far. Then there's going to be a fourth one, The Dark Continent Chronicles. They're a thrill ride halfway around the world, full of twists and unforgettable characters. James Gardner, it has been a pleasure.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks.
I'm Ann Bocock. For more stories, please tune in for the next Between the Covers.